Coffee mug slipped from my hands when I read the letter. Not because I was shocked, not because I didn't see it coming, but because after 41 years of being a father, after working double shifts at the plant until my knees gave out, after signing my name on every loan, every school form, every hospital bill, I was being asked to vacate my own property within 30 days. The letter had my son-in-law's signature at the bottom. My son had put his hand over mine and nodded when I asked if he agreed. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a letter. It starts the way most quiet disasters start, with a small thing that seemed reasonable at the time. My name is Howard. I'm 63 years old. I spent 32 years working at a manufacturing facility outside Columbus, Ohio. My wife Marlene passed 8 years ago, ovarian cancer 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the house felt like a building I happened to sleep in. 4 bedrooms. A kitchen she'd painted yellow twice because the first shade wasn't quite right. A backyard where we used to sit on Sunday mornings and drink bad coffee and not say much of anything, and it was enough. My son is 34. I'll call him by the name that matters to me, which is my boy. But for the purposes of this story, his name is Griffin. Griffin was a good kid. I mean that honestly, not the way parents say it when they're trying to excuse bad behavior. He was thoughtful. He used to call me on his lunch breaks just to check in. When Marlene got sick, he drove 4 hours every weekend for almost a year. He held her hand. He cried when he thought I wasn't looking. Then he married Cassandra. I want to be careful here because I've spent a long time examining my own role in what happened. Cassandra isn't a villain in some simple story. She's a woman who grew up with money and married a man who didn't have much, and somewhere along the way she decided that closing that gap was the most important project of her life. I don't hate her for that. I understand it. I just didn't understand what it would cost me. They got married 3 years after Marlene passed. I walked Griffin down the aisle, which is not traditional, but he asked me to, and I would have done anything he asked that day. The wedding was beautiful. Cassandra's parents, her father, a retired attorney named something I won't bother remembering, and her mother, a woman who looked at my sport coat the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth, sat in the front row and smiled the smiles of people who have learned to perform warmth without feeling it. I smiled back. I was good at that too. The first year was fine. Griffin and Cassandra bought a house 40 minutes from mine, a nice colonial in a suburb that had a Whole Foods and a wine bar and a farmer's market that cost more than my grocery bill. I visited on holidays. We had dinners that were pleasant and slightly formal, like meetings between allies who don't entirely trust each other. Then Cassandra got pregnant. And then Griffin lost his job. The layoff happened in February, 2 months before the baby was due. The company he'd worked for, a mid-sized logistics firm, was acquired and his department was eliminated. He told me on the phone, trying to keep his voice level, and I could hear the fear underneath it the way you can hear a crack in ice before it gives. I said, "Come stay with me, both of you, until you get back on your feet." I meant it as a temporary offer. 3-4 months maybe, long enough for him to find something, for the baby to arrive safely, for them to build up some savings before renting again. Griffin hesitated. Cassandra apparently did not. They moved in 6 weeks later with 2 cars, a storage unit's worth of furniture, and a renovation plan. That last part I didn't know about until they were already there. The baby came in April. A boy. They named him something with 3 syllables that I could never quite say naturally, so I called him Bud, and he seemed fine with that. He had Marlene's eyes, that specific shade of gray-green that I'd spent 40 years looking at. And when I held him for the first time in the hospital, I thought, okay, this is why. This is the reason for all of it. The first few months were exhausting and good. I got up at night when the baby cried, so Griffin and Cassandra could sleep. I cooked. I fixed the gutters. I repainted the trim on the front porch because it was peeling and no one else seemed to notice or care. Cassandra's parents visited often. Her father, who I'll call the attorney, had opinions about everything, the neighborhood, the school district, the layout of the kitchen. He never addressed them to me directly. He addressed them to Cassandra in a tone that assumed I wasn't in the room, or that if I was, my presence wasn't particularly relevant to the conversation. I let it go. I told myself they were adjusting. I told myself families take time. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to hear it yet, was what I noticed happening with Griffin. It was gradual. The calls stopped. Not all at once, just the frequency changed. Where he used to check in for no reason, now he mostly texted. Where he used to ask my opinion on things, now decisions were made and I was informed after. Small things, the kind of thing you could dismiss each time it happened. But I've been keeping mental accounts my whole life, the way people who grew up without much money learned to do, and the balance was shifting. Then came the Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't. Cassandra's parents had been visiting for the week. Her mother had taken over the kitchen starting Monday, reorganizing cabinets, replacing spices she deemed inadequate, making comments about the lighting that were technically about the lighting but were somehow also about me. I stayed out of her way. I ate breakfast early, took long walks, found reasons to be in other rooms. On Thanksgiving itself, we sat down to a table that Cassandra had set beautifully. I'll give her that. She had a gift for surfaces. The candles, the linen, the little cards with everyone's names. I found my card at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door. The seat that catches the draft when someone goes in or out. The attorney sat at the head. I didn't say anything. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and watched my son take his seat next to his father-in-law without once glancing in my direction. That was the moment I understood. Not that I was unwelcome. I already knew that. But that Griffin had made a choice about which world he wanted to live in, and that world had no room for the draft end of a table. I ate my turkey. I complimented the stuffing. I helped clear the plates. That night, in Marlene's kitchen, I stood at the sink and washed the dishes that Cassandra's mother had decided needed rewashing, and I thought about what I was going to do. I called my accountant the following Monday. He's a man named Phil, who I've known since the late 90s. Sharp, no nonsense, does not enjoy being asked to do things twice. I told him I wanted to review everything. The house deed, the mortgage payoff records, the property tax history. All of it. Phil pulled the files and confirmed what I already knew. The house was mine, free and clear, paid off in 2019 after a second job I'd worked for 11 years. My name was the only name on the deed. No one else had any legal standing. Then I called a real estate attorney. I didn't tell Griffin. I didn't tell anyone. I just needed to understand my options clearly before I made any decisions. That's something I learned from 30 years in manufacturing. You never start a process until you understand the tolerances. The attorney, a woman named something professional I'll leave out, explained the concept of tenants at will. In Ohio, when you have occupants living in your home without a lease and without paying rent, they are considered tenants at will. To remove them legally, you issue a written notice, typically 30 days, and if they don't comply, you proceed through the court system. I thanked her. I wrote her a check. I drove home and made dinner and ate it alone at Marlene's yellow kitchen table while Griffin and Cassandra had theirs in the dining room with the door closed. I didn't act on any of it yet. I was gathering information, deciding. Because unlike what people might think, this was never about anger. It was about clarity. I had spent 3 years slowly disappearing inside my own house, and I needed to understand what it would take to stop. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. I came downstairs to find it on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl, addressed to me in Cassandra's handwriting. It was typed, not handwritten. 2 paragraphs. It informed me that Griffin and Cassandra were exploring options to expand the household, and that, given the space constraints, it might be mutually beneficial to discuss whether the current living arrangement still served everyone's needs. The 3rd paragraph. There was a 3rd paragraph I misspoke, asked me to let them know within 2 weeks whether I would be open to transitioning to the in-law suite above the garage. The in-law suite I had built with my own savings 12 years ago, originally intended as a space for Marlene's mother, who died before she could use it. A single room, a bathroom, a small window overlooking the driveway, no kitchen, no private entrance. My own house, my own name on the deed, and they were asking me to move into a room with no kitchen. I set the letter down on the counter, poured myself a coffee, stood at the window and watched the neighbor's dog cross the yard. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. What happened over the next 6 weeks, I am not going to describe in full detail, because most of it was paperwork and phone calls, and the quiet, tedious machinery of legal process. But I will tell you the parts that mattered. I had the deed reviewed again, confirmed, my name, no one else's. I had Phil prepare a full accounting of every utility, property tax payment, insurance premium, and maintenance expense since Griffin and Cassandra moved in, 31 months of costs. I had paid all of it. They had paid nothing, not rent, not utilities, not a single grocery run that was logged against their presence in my house. Griffin had eventually found a new job, a decent one in supply chain management, and they had been saving while I absorbed every cost. I had the attorney prepare a formal notice to vacate, 30 days, in compliance with Ohio law, certified mail to Griffin's name. A copy slid under their bedroom door. I did not tell them in advance. I did not request a meeting. I did not write an emotional letter explaining my feelings. I had tried conversations. I had tried patience. I had tried patience. I had tried making myself smaller and quieter and easier to ignore for the better part of 3 years. What I had not tried was the one language that cuts through everything else. Legal reality. The morning they found the notice, Griffin came downstairs white-faced holding the envelope. Cassandra was behind him. She looked at me the way I imagined she looked at opposing counsel. Contained, calculating, already scanning for weaknesses. Griffin said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "You've been served notice under Ohio tenancy law. You have 30 days. He said, "You can't be serious." I said, "I had an attorney review everything. You are tenants at will. The notice is valid." Cassandra said, "This is insane. We have a child here." I said, "I know. I've been cooking breakfast for him for 2.5 years. There was a silence. The baby monitor on the counter crackled, Bud shifting in his crib upstairs. Griffin said, "Dad, please. Can we just talk about this?" And here's the part I've thought about most since then. Because I looked at my son, my boy, the one who used to call me on his lunch breaks, the one who drove 4 hours every weekend when his mother was dying. And I felt the full weight of everything that could have been different. I said, "I've been trying to talk to you for 3 years. And then I walked upstairs because I had nothing else to say. The 30 days were difficult. I will not pretend otherwise. There were arguments, late at night, doors closing hard, voices carrying through walls. Cassandra's parents came for a week and I heard the attorney on the phone with someone, presumably another lawyer, presumably trying to find an angle. There wasn't one. I had been careful. My son tried 4 more conversations. In each one, he started with hurt and moved toward anger and ended somewhere that resembled pleading. I listened to all of it. I did not change course. What I did not expect was Griffin's second-to-last conversation, the one that almost broke me. He came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning, just the 2 of us, sat down across from me with his coffee. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "I know I stopped showing up for you. I don't have a good reason." I looked at him. He said, "I think I convinced myself you were fine. That you didn't need anything. That you were just here. Like the house was just here." I said, "Your mother would have noticed." He nodded. He didn't argue with that. I said, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I need you to understand that. I'm doing this because I have 11, maybe 12 years left where I can live in my own house and have a cup of coffee in my own kitchen and go to bed without wondering if I'm in the way. I'm 63, Griffin. I'm not going to give that up. Not even for you." He cried. He's not a man who cries easily. He gets that from me. So when the tears came, they surprised both of us. I got up and put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was small and scared of something. I held it there for a moment. Then I said, "Find a good house, something with a yard for Bud. I'll help with the deposit if you're short." He wiped his face, nodded. He said, "Are we going to be okay?" I said, I don't know yet, but we're not going to find out while you're living in my house. They left on a Friday. I watched from the front porch, coffee in hand, as the moving truck backed into the driveway. Cassandra didn't look at me. The attorney supervised from the sidewalk. Bud, strapped to Griffin's chest in a carrier, looked over his father's shoulder at me with those gray-green eyes, and I waved, and he didn't wave back because he's two, but he made a sound that I decided to interpret as acknowledgement. Griffin paused at the foot of the porch steps. We looked at each other. He said, "I'll call you." I said, "I know you will." And I meant that, not as a threat, not as a conditional. I meant it because I know my son. And underneath everything that happened, the 3 years of slow erasure, the Thanksgiving table, the letter about the in-law suite, underneath all of that is the man who held his mother's hand, and he is still there. He's just going to have to find his way back on his own terms. It's been 4 months since they left. The house is quiet in a way that took some getting used to. There are days when the silence is so complete that I catch myself listening for footsteps that aren't there, for the baby monitor that's no longer on the counter. Grief and relief can live in the same room. I've known that since Marlene died. I know it again now. Griffin called 3 weeks after moving out. It was short, logistics, mostly, something about mail still coming to my address. But before he hung up, he said, "Bud asked about you." I said, "Tell him Grandpa says hi." There was a pause. Griffin said, "Yeah, I will." We've talked more since then. Not back to what we were. Not yet. But the calls are getting longer. Last week, he asked my opinion on something, whether a neighborhood he was considering had good schools. I told him what I thought. He listened. It's not forgiveness exactly. It's something more patient than that. It's the understanding that some damage doesn't undo itself overnight, that the relationship between a father and a son is not a ledger that balances cleanly, that you can love someone and still hold the line. I go to bed now in Marlene's house, my house, and the yellow kitchen catches the morning light the way it always has, and I drink my coffee, and I don't wonder if I'm in the way. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. I keep thinking about the fruit bowl. That's where Cassandra left the letter, propped against the fruit bowl in my kitchen, in my house, addressed to me in her handwriting. A typed letter. 2 paragraphs asking me to move into a room with no kitchen and a window overlooking the driveway. I've thought about that detail more than I probably should. Not the cruelty of it exactly, more the confidence, the assumption that I would read it, fold it back up, and quietly begin moving my things. That confidence didn't come from nowhere. It came from 3 years of me allowing it. That's the part people don't want to hear. Not the letter, not the eviction, not the attorney. The part that matters most is the 3 years before any of that. Every time I moved to the edge of a room to make space. Every Thanksgiving I ate beside the kitchen door and said nothing. Every morning I made breakfast for a household that had stopped seeing me as anything more than furniture. Each time I let something go without saying a word, I was teaching everyone in that house exactly how much my silence cost them. Which was nothing. I'm not saying I deserved what happened. I don't believe in simple ledgers like that. But I understand now that kindness without limits doesn't protect the people you love. It just removes every reason for them to examine their own behavior. Griffin didn't become cruel overnight. He drifted. And I let him drift because I told myself it was the loving thing to do. What I was actually doing was protecting myself from a hard conversation. The hard conversation would have been, I see what's happening, and I need it to stop. Instead, I filed it away. Kept accounts in my head the way I'd learned to do with money. Tracking every small thing, never saying the total out loud. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up as patience. What I eventually understood, sitting in my attorney's office with 31 months of expense records on the table, is that standing up for yourself is not the same as being unkind. There's a version of the story where I lose my temper and say things I can't take back. There's another version where I do nothing and eventually disappear into that garage room and stop existing as a person with rights. Neither of those is the right story. The right story requires you to think clearly when everything in you wants to react emotionally. It requires you to know what the law says, what your name on a deed means, what options are actually available to you, and then act from that knowledge rather than from pain. That's not coldness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is, the kind that doesn't announce itself. And then there's Griffin, my boy who cried at the kitchen table and said he'd convinced himself I didn't need anything. I believed him. I still believe him. That's what makes it complicated. He didn't stop caring about me because he's a bad person. He stopped paying attention because it was easy not to, and no one made it harder, including me. So when people ask whether what I did was justice or revenge, I think they're asking the wrong question. What I did was refuse to disappear. That's all. And the consequence, the 30-day notice, the moving truck, the slow rebuilding of something real between my son and me, all of that followed naturally from one decision, to be honest about what I needed. Finally, even when it was very late, and even when it was very late, and even when it cost something. It cost something. I won't pretend it didn't. But I go to bed now in my own house, and that yellow kitchen catches the morning light the way it always has. And I think Marlene would have made me do this years ago.